Jesus said to the disciples, "You've heard that it was said to those of ancient times, 'You shall not murder,' and whoever murders shall be liable to judgment. But I say to you that if you're angry with a brother or sister, you'll be liable to judgment. And if you insult a brother or sister, you'll be liable to the council. And if you say, 'You fool,' you'll be liable to the hell of fire." So when you are offering your gift at the altar, if you remember that your brother or sister has something against you, leave your gift there before the altar and go. First be reconciled to your brother or sister, and then come and offer your gift. Come to terms quickly with your accuser while you're on the way to court with them, or your accuser may hand you over to the judge, and the judge to the guard, and you'll be thrown into prison. Truly, I tell you, you'll never get out until you've paid the last penny. Now, you've heard that it was said, 'You shall not commit adultery.' But I say to you that everyone who looks at a woman with lust has already committed adultery with her in his heart. If your right eye causes you to sin, tear it out. Throw it away. It's better for you to lose one of your members than for your whole body be thrown into hell. And if your right hand causes you to sin, cut it off and throw it away. It's better for you to lose one of your members than for your whole body to go into hell. Well, it was also said, 'Whoever divorces his wife, let him give her a certificate of divorce.' But I say to you that anyone who divorces his wife except on the ground of unchastity causes her to commit adultery. Whoever marries a divorced woman commits adultery. Again, you've heard that it was said to those of ancient times, 'You shall not swear falsely, but carry out the vows that you've made to God.' But I say to you, do not swear at all, either by heaven, for it is the throne of God, or by the earth, for it is his footstool, or by Jerusalem, for it's the city of the great king. Do not swear by your head, for you cannot make one hair white or black. Let your word be yes, yes, or no, no. Anything more than this comes from the evil one." The gospel of the Lord. You may be seated. Whew. I'll tell you, I just wanted to whisper that whole gospel because it's so difficult to read in its judgmental flavor. And it seems to me that Jesus here makes the case that even though there may only be 613 commandments, there seem to be a million ways to break each one. In fact, 10 commandments doesn't seem like that much to follow until you read the fine print. Jesus instructs us to act responsibly, to think of the long-term consequences, if you at all can, before doing or saying something foolish and hurtful or attention-seeking. But another point is also made, that if you read all of biblical law literally, you may very well discover it is impossible for anyone but God to obey biblical laws perfectly. This is because biblical law can't keep us from making mistakes. But it can remind us that everyone does make mistakes. And sometimes we are driven by impulses and hormones, emotions and tempers. and desires which must be kept in check. That must be kept in check somehow by a power greater than any temporary temptation. There's an old saying that goes like this: check yourself before you wreck yourself. You heard that one? I think it was from hip hop a while back. Check yourself before you wreck yourself. But it makes sense that we have to check ourselves before we allow ourselves to go down a slippery slope of hurt, of damage done in our relationships, of hurt done to our spiritual lives. There's a difference, as we heard in our children's sermon, about these two statements. See if you can hear the difference. I am angry versus I feel anger. One defines us as the feeling. The other recognizes that we are more than any feeling that we have. That we have a control, a way to understand what we are feeling and to change those feelings with alternatives. The difference between I am angry versus I feel angry or I feel anger. Differentiating ourselves from the actual emotions that we feel helps us to get past them, helps us to move through them, helps us to get into a better place. Because God cares about what we do, but even more about what we think. Even more about what we think and believe. Jesus says, I say to you, if you're angry with a brother or sister, if you just feel this way, we're going to have to deal with these feelings and not just the actions you take from those feelings. Because God cares not about just what we do, but also about what we think and feel and believe. A famous author named Viktor Frankl once wrote this. He says, the facts of our lives are not as important as our attitudes towards them. And sometimes those attitudes can be like holding a grudge at something that we've experienced in our past. And that attitude can keep us in the moment and keep returning us to that moment of those feelings. And God knows that we each have inner desires and passions, joys and angers. And God wants us to own up to them. Take responsibility for what we feel and how we act. To accept that our behaviors are deeply driven by physical, emotional decisions. And sometimes it is our body which is trying to tell us what to do, trying to tell us what to do. Now, this is the case especially with hunger. Our body tries to tell us it is hungry, it wants to eat. But how much we eat, and if we continue eating past the time when we're full, this is a more complicated issue than just eating versus not eating. Our Gut, the Second Brain, is the title of a book. And I found in this that an average man, it didn't say about the female, I think it's a little bit for the female, but the average man contains on average 30 trillion human cells, but 39 trillion bacteria. 30 trillion human cells and almost 40 trillion bacteria. That's in the average human. Everything wants to eat, including the bacteria and the yeast in our gut. It has its own desires, its own needs, its own mechanisms. But when the yeast in our gut tells us that it wants its favorite food, which is sugar, because yeast feeds on sugar. That's what makes bread rise. Yeast loves the sugar, and that yeast communicates chemically with our minds, with our bodies, and tells us it wants the sugar. But when the yeast tells our body that we should eat only its favorite food, sugar, that isn't necessarily the healthiest nutrient for the rest of our cells and our bodies. Sometimes our physical bodies chemically tell us to do things like overeat, that our brains have to override, that our conscience has to remember to limit, that we have to control and regulate ourselves because our bodies aren't just our own. Our bodies are part of an ecosystem within us and outside of us. Because Jesus doesn't want us to harm ourselves or others, but he isn't trying to make the Jewish law more difficult. When he's talking about these difficult issues, about murder, about divorce, about anger, he isn't trying to make the law more difficult for us. Jesus is telling his disciples to understand why people do stuff. Why do we do stuff in the first place that we often regret later? Why is it that we do things? And while you can't unsee or undo many things in our lives, blaming your eyes for what you see is a misunderstanding of how to stay healthy. If you cut your hand off because you think it's your hand that's causing you to sin, maybe you're misunderstanding the causes of sin in your life. The victim's family will often ask, why? Why did they do it? The movie scenes where the murderer stands before their victim explaining why they're getting revenge or whatever. It's often some old grudge. They've wanted revenge all these years. They've held on to this emotional connection to this experience. And while these are usually over-dramatizations and don't happen in real life, nevertheless, they speak to our need for explanations as to why people do stuff. Why on earth would you do this? Why would you ruin a relationship? Why would you ruin something in your life? Well, there's a lot of reasons. And there's a need to speak to why and how emotions of our bodies hold grudges and retain these feelings that are hard to get past and let go. These reasons why somebody does something, even self-destructive, is important. It's important to God. The reason why we did something is important. Think about hate crimes. The reason why they happen is important to the law. It's not just the actions themselves, but it's what's going on in the person's mind when they do something. Why on earth would they do something like this? They're judged on their thoughts and not just actions. And this is also true when people try to achieve a good end through hurtful means, through destructive means. They want to be rich, and so the lottery or gambling becomes part of their routine, and they realize that the ends that they want aren't justified by the means of loss that they endure. The hurtful, harmful means to an end. We think we have a good goal. We have a good goal to make something stronger or better, but the way that we do it can have consequences that last our whole life and throughout the lives of others. So this book, Craving, I have a book called Craving, Why We Can't Seem to Get Enough. That's the title of the book, Why We Can't Seem to Get Enough. Explores some reasons why people do stuff. Now this is interesting because it says you don't crave everything you want. Cravings, distinct from desires, are truly unpleasant and disturbingly intense. Now this is expanding the idea of why people do things. It's not just desires, not just needs or wants. There's also these other emotional components that are biophysical in our bodies, that are related to our emotions, are related to our hormones, that are related to our regulatory systems. And cravings, distinct from desires, are truly unpleasant and disturbingly intense. He says, a craving is a strong desire that, if unfulfilled, produces powerful physical and mental suffering. Now, we're going to need to have some kind of frame of reference for what suffering is, but he goes on to say, in addictions, cravings are often the very reason a person acts out on their addiction. Cravings, which left unfulfilled, can produce an unwanted effect in our lives, a powerful physical and mental suffering. Sometimes we just got to suffer, though. Sometimes we have to wait. Sometimes it's healthier for us to go without than to feed something that is going to hurt us in the long run. And to remind you about this, Bethel is home to support groups. About 30 to 40 support groups for many addictions of many kinds, including sexual addictions. Addictions that are hurtful in themselves and hurtful to others. Like sexual addictions. Why? Well, because Jesus even talks about this in our gospel, describing the damaged marriage relationships and how every sexual encounter encodes its own memory in our minds and in our bodies. The cravings of lust or marital infidelity aren't exempt from memory. It's the toughest part of doing something is you're going to remember it, or you're going to try and blot it out of your memory through some other chemical experience. But our bodies remember. They remember everything that we've done. They remember the trauma. They remember the blessings. Our bodies, our brains, our soul remembers what we've done. And the brain and the body remember things, and DNA gets exchanged, gets mingled, and then so do the excuses and cover-ups. And it unfortunately doesn't matter how smart we are. Jesus says that everyone is vulnerable to the urges, the desires, and even the dangers of cravings. And then comes the guilt. And then comes that second way of hurting ourselves, the second way of beating ourselves up, the guilt over something that has been done. That we not only sin against God in the action and in the thought, but also in the consequence of harming ourselves by this hurtful emotion that actually hurts our hearts and keeps us from focusing on other helpful things in our lives. It's because our body and our minds, our souls, get involved with these things as Jesus describes at various levels. It's not just through the action, but also through the thoughts, through the experience, the emotions. All these various levels which seem so mild and harmless. It's just a thought, right? But it's like the chemical safety thresholds of parts per million in contaminants and toxins. Parts per million. Just one tiny speck in a million could be enough to harm you. And in some ways, this is what Jesus is letting us know, that all of these layers affect us, and we need ways to manage them, ways to control them, keep them in check, so we can check ourselves before we wreck something that's important and life-giving to us. And so Jesus exposes the danger, that the slippery slope, if we don't check ourselves, if we don't take the action to correct and to say sorry and to find a new way forward with our partners, with ourselves, and with others in our lives. He says, he exposes this. He says, if you remember that a brother or sister has something against you, he goes on to say, first be reconciled, or your accuser may hand you over to the judge. It's this escalation, this denial that causes things to build up, to repress things in our lives and to try and hold them back, when Jesus is saying, no, we need to be honest. We need to take responsibility, because that's the only way that we're going to be healthy, emotionally healthy and whole and wholesome. If people haven't forgotten about you or what you may have said or done, take the healing steps to bring issues to light. Find a positive new situation to remember each other by, instead of holding on to an ill word or a trespass of another. Jesus tells us in the Lord's Prayer, forgive us our trespasses as we forgive those who trespass against us. It's right there. It's right there in our central prayerful faith. So we're invited to grow and outgrow our past errors with God. We're invited to outgrow our negative thoughts and our cravings and behaviors, and we're given God's grace so that shame won't stop us from growing healthy again. Because shame and guilt can keep us from moving forward in our lives. And so we're invited to trust God's Spirit to forgive, to give us that inner healing, God's grace to heal us for God's sake, for salvation. God gives us this grace for another day. And Jesus emphasizes that we do have decisions to make. And I was reminded of the movie Frozen again. And it says, people make bad decisions when they're mad or scared or stressed, but throw a little love their way. Because true love brings out the best. Jesus brings love into our lives because he knows we're scared, we're mad, we're stressed, all these things that add up. And we can try and cover them up in our lives. We can try and block them out and say, whoa, I didn't experience that. But the healthy, healing, spiritual way forward is to take responsibility and then to receive God's grace to give us a new opportunity